Our Tuesday small group is working through a little book on interpreting the Bible, and the chapter that we're looking at this week and next week has to do with interpreting the Psalms from the Old Testament. And so I thought I'd pick a particular psalm of thanksgiving that might be appropriate for our setting at this time. And I think I'll entitle this little lesson, Never Say Never. Never is a long time, right? And I'm sure a lot of you has said, I'll never move to Alaska, or I'll never marry that man, or I'll never eat that, or I'll never work for this organization, or I'll never be fired or laid off. You know, never is a long time. And so there's a lot of truth in this expression to say never. But Psalm 30 is a really good example of what the psalmist went through as a life where he thought everything was stable and unmovable. It all kind of fell apart for a while, and then it came back together. And so this song is written after the fact, after this guy has gone through this terrible ordeal where things were going well and he thought he'd never be shaken and things would just always stay as stable and unflappable as they had been. Life falls apart for a while. His health is taken from him, and then God answers his prayer and things are brought back again. So let me just read this to you and then we'll say a few things about it. It says, I'll exalt you, O Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths and did not let my enemies gloat over me. My Lord, O Lord, my God, I called to you for help and you healed me. O Lord, you brought me up from the grave. You spared me from going down to the pit. Sing to the Lord, all you saints of his. Praise his holy name. For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may remain for a night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Now, the turning point in this passage is verse 6. He says, when I felt secure, I said, I will never be shaken. Our lesson today is never say never. You know what happens next. O Lord, when you favored me, you made my mountain stand firm. But when you hid your face, I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I called. To the Lord I cried for mercy. What gain is there in my destruction, in my going down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it proclaim your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my help. You turn my wailing into dancing, and you remove my sackcloth and clothe me with joy, that my heart may sing to you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give you thanks forever. So notice this is a song of thanksgiving. It begins and ends the same. I will exalt you, O Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths. And then it ends, O Lord, I will give thanks to you forever. So he has gone through this ordeal, this difficult time. But prior to that, notice verse 6 here, things felt secure. He was just fine. But then problems came to him. And notice what some of these problems were. You've lifted me out of the depths. My enemies were gloating over me. It sounds like this was some kind of sickness because he was healed. God eventually healed him. Maybe a near-death kind of sickness because he was brought near to the grave. Something happened where trouble came upon him. His enemies were excited about that, and they liked that. And he appeals to God, and God delivers him. So let's look at this in just a little bit more detail. We know here in Alaska about the tidal flats and the mud and people getting stuck in the mire and just what it takes to get people out of that. And we're familiar with experiences where we've had trouble in the mud. I remember one time I was out fishing and the tide went out, and as the tide went out, I found this pair of fishing waders, hip boots, stuck in the mud. The person was gone. He had long since slipped out of those boots, but the boots were still there, stuck in the mud. And this is kind of the imagery that we have here in this first verse where he says, "You lifted me out of the depths." The imagery there could be mud, could be water, out of this difficult time that this person was going through. This is what we have here in this imagery. So there's three existential problems. There's the sinking mud beneath him in verse 1. There's enemies around him who want him to fail, and you know, that's kind of human nature to be excited when someone else is going through problems. Sometimes it makes us feel a little better when someone else is going through issues. And then distress within him as he felt abandoned by God. I think these are all things that are part of what it means to be human. We go through a difficult time. People around us are not supportive. Internally, we're distressed over these difficulties that come our way. So you have this descending imagery in verse 1. Let me read it to you again here. It says, I'll exalt you, O Lord. You lifted me out of the depths and did not let my enemies gloat over me. O Lord, my God, I called to you for help and you healed me. O Lord, you brought me up from the grave. You spared me from going down to the pit. So there's this descending imagery of, he uses the three different words to talk about death: the grave, the pit, and then in English it's translated the same way again in verse 9 in this translation that we're using, but it's actually a different word in the Hebrew, where, man, this guy's going down. And it sounds like he almost died. That's the issue here. And it sounds much like some kind of physical illness that has beset him. Because he says, I called to you for help and you healed me. Now, it could have been some kind of emotional healing or spiritual healing, but the language sounds like there was something physical going on. So this is the first existential problem, is this guy was drowning. He was sinking in the mud. He was descending and getting worse and worse as time was going on. His second existential problem was enemies were around him. Now, why is it that some love to see others fail? I don't know if it's part of the human condition or if it's just human nature or what, but you know, in football, they have penalties for taunting and they have penalties for piling on. And I don't know if you can see in this piling on penalty, there's a little helmet here with looks like a Cardinals helmet. Poor guy's buried in these other guys that have piled on top of him. It's bad enough to be going through problems, but when your enemies taunt you and when they pile on and you feel this added pressure, it makes that life that much more difficult. And I think the higher profile a person is the more public a person is, the more inclined they are to be criticized and people to taunt or to pile on. And so when somebody's going through a difficult time, their enemies take advantage of that. And then his last existential problem was distress, internal distress. And, you know, in verse 6 there, he says, man, I will never be moved. Life is good. And then it was good until it wasn't. And then he says, and then God, you hid your face from me. I felt secure. But then look what happened. We have lots of other indications in the Bible where this same language is used. Job says, why do you hide your face? The book of Psalms, how long will you hide your face from me? You hide your face from your sins. Don't hide your face. Answer me quickly. This idea where we feel that God is not looking, God is not watching, God seemingly doesn't care. But this is the only time in the Bible where he looks backwards after the fact and says, God, there was a time where you hid your face from me. You know, I'm not afraid to admit it. You just kind of left me hanging. You abandoned me during this difficult time. So this is his third existential problem. So what does he do? It's simple. He cries for help. Don't be too stubborn to ask for help from others, to ask for God. In the midst of his dilemma, that's what he does, is he goes to the Lord and he asks God to deliver him. And so this psalm, overall, it has these 7 contrasts that I just want to kind of close out this study by pointing these out. One was this contrast between him being almost dead to his healing, the first few verses, and then this contrast in time where it may have seemed like a long time, but his suffering was just a moment in comparison to the lifetime of blessing God had given him. This contrast between God's anger and God's favor. He says, you were angry with me. And I don't know if God was really angry or if he just felt that God was angry. But you have this contrast between God's anger and God's blessing. From night until morning, the darkness there, this dark night of the soul, this time of blackness that he went through. From his security to being shaken and dismayed. It's a big contrast in this psalm. From his wailing to dancing, and then from his silence over his dilemma to praise. And so I know it's easy for us to have hindsight and to look back in the midst of things, and we have a lot of psalms that are written in the midst of the difficulty. But this particular psalm is written after the fact. And we all go through life with wanted and unwanted surprises. These wanted and unwanted surprises reveal our character. Sometimes we think nothing will ever change when things are going well. We get kind of secure and say, hey, you know, I'll never be shaken. And then when things are going bad, we get distraught and we say, is this never gonna get better? Some of you have been laid off recently. You've lost your jobs and you thought the last thing that would ever happen is that you've lost your work. And some of you are in companies with long histories here in our state that are closing due to COVID-19 and some of the financial hardships. And so we're surprised when things fall apart, and sometimes we're equally surprised when things improve and come back to normal. But this lesson here is that in the midst of this, in the midst of these crises that the writer was feeling, is he put his trust in God, he prayed to him, and left his life in the hands of God, which is what we do. That's why we believe. That's why we have faith. So take another look at Psalm 30, read it through a couple times, and get kind of a feel for this.